I'm joined today by my good friend Kevin Sutton, assistant coach with University of Rhode Island. And Coach, my first question for you is, have you ever had any personal experience with either nonviolent, unconstitutional police harassment or non-lethal, unconstitutional police brutality?
I haven't personally, but I will say this: my son, who lives in Atlanta, who just recently was, pulled over and by the police, and he was going up a hill, and he has a governor on his truck for his job, and they were saying that he was doing 70 miles per hour. And it's one, they had a governor on a truck, so it's not possible for that to happen. And two, the other thing is that he wasn't going 70 miles per hour, first and foremost. But what he was pulled over and detained, and his truck was searched several times, and it was just a situation where you just clearly knew that it was. He was being targeted, because it's just not possible for a truck of his size that was carrying a load could go up a hill 70 miles per hour with the governor on the truck. And but thank God his employer fought it and believed him, and so he was able to obviously keep his job. But it was just one of those situations where he was just pulled over. And of course, the first thing that he said was that, this wasn't a random, pullover. He wasn't being targeted. But in actuality, I just find it very hard to believe, that, he got pulled over.
And so, in addition to your son and other family members and friends, I know that these conversations occur, and I'm curious to know. I know you haven't done a formal survey, but I'm curious to know approximately of the black men in your life, family or friends who are adults. Roughly what percent have, at a minimum, experienced unconstitutional, nonviolent police harassment, whether it be getting pulled over when you hadn't committed a moving violation, whether it means walking down the street with a group of black friends and up rolls a cop and demands to see everybody's ID, or just generally being treated with suspicion or hostility for no valid reason. Roughly what percent of your black friends and family who are men have had that type of experience?
I would venture to say between 60 and 65%.
So a clear majority. And like I said, I know you haven't sent a survey out, but I also know you've been having conversations with friends and family on these topics for quite some time. And so my last question in the formal part of the interview is, if it's a clear majority, 60, 65%, 2/3, would you call, and so to back up for context, like we've talked about before, a lot of white people look at just the murders, the police on black murders, and we don't connect culturally that the culture that permits the nonviolent harassment and targeting of black people and the lack of respect for black people's constitutional rights, that culture is connected to the brutality, which is less frequent than the harassment, and to the murders, which is less frequent than the brutality. And so a lot of white people, when they see what happened to George Floyd, they tend to think, well, that's terrible, but it's isolated. Like, this is a overreaction to, because again, they don't culturally connect these things. And so the last question in the formal part of the interview is, do you consider a clear majority to constitute isolated, as way too many white people insist, or would you call it something that's more pervasive that needs to be faced and finally addressed?
Oh, without question, Peter, it needs to be faced and addressed. We're seeing now, with everyone having a cell phone with a camera, we're just seeing it more prevalent. But these things have been happening for throughout history. And because people didn't have cameras or weren't willing to speak out on these type of issues, and it wasn't brought into our living rooms or on our social media page now. So people just try to say, oh, these are isolated incidents. How many isolated incidents does it take? Is it not enough that just one isolated incident, if you want to call it that, with George Floyd, is that not enough? Or does it have to get to 10 or does it have to get to 20? You know, and I say this, Peter, it's really interesting, and I found it interesting that I was at Georgetown University some 6 years ago, and we were the first college team to wear the shirts, "I Can't Breathe." And I find it just so interesting that less than a decade later, the exact words verbatim were spoken by, his last breath was, "I can't breathe," George Floyd. Just, it's not even been a decade. It hasn't even been a decade to now. The George Floyd said this exact same thing, and that the reason why we were wearing the shirts, like I said, less than a decade ago. And just equally as important is the young lady in Central Park, Amy. When she used the opportunity to knowing that she could call the police and say that an African American was harassing her, that she knew that the police would come to her aid and would arrest him or question him or detain him based on and believe her over him, when in actuality it was him doing the right thing and asking her to put her leash on her dog, when it clearly stated that she was supposed to have a leash on the dog.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because the purpose of these interviews is to drill home the point to white people that the issues that black people face with police are not isolated. But you're right; it's much more pervasive than just in policing, right? We don't because if a black man goes to a bank and he's well qualified for a loan and doesn't receive it, it's not going to be national news. And it's been, these types of things are sadly and unfortunately so normal in America, they become normalized. And
Absolutely. They have become so normalized, that it's like, second thought, oh well. But no, it's not. It's not a matter of oh well. I mean, for me, it's the covert racism that is so much more powerful and so much more pervasive than the overt racism. If I know from that you don't like me for the color of my skin, and you're outspoken about that, you're overtly racist to me, and you treat me in such a way, that I'm, beneath you because of the color of my skin. I can, that's one thing I know I can fight head on. But it's the covert racism that takes place, like you said, going into a bank when you're fully qualified, okay, and you come out and they say, oh well, you don't meet the criteria. And then you ask them what the criteria are, and then they try to go around it and give you all these, various reasons, and then full well that you are qualified, for that. Your credit scores are good enough. You have enough money. You have enough collateral. And it's just a systematic ways of oppression that are just need to be, spoken about and need to be called out whenever it happens.
I'll give you a stat that you may or may not be aware of, but there's so many white people, they insist that not only are these things isolated, but it's in the past. Oh, it's not the 1940s anymore. This stuff doesn't happen. And in 2011, okay, not the 1940s, Bank of America was fined $335 million because the Justice Department investigated and found that they were systematically either charging black borrowers higher interest or denying black borrowers altogether or lending them less money than requested. And this is in side-by-side comparisons with white people with identical credit scores and identical financial resources. And the thing that people don't get is you said it exactly right. Overt versus covert. I'm of the opinion that virtually every single white person in America is a racist, at least to some extent, on a 10-point scale, right? Where like a 10 is like the George Floyd's murderer, someone who has hate in their heart and desires to actively, violently harm black people. Well, fortunately, there aren't very many 10s as a percent. As a raw number, unfortunately, there are millions of 10s. But as a percent, it's the minority. But the bank officers that were shafting black borrowers, it wasn't based on hatred. It probably wasn't even based on conscious bias, but rather subconscious via brainwashing. And so these things truly are still pervasive. And, I, for one, wish that we would hold leaders criminally accountable, because Bank of America had $6 billion in profit in the quarter that they were fined $335 million. And they've been fined multi-millions of dollars since then for the same thing. So
it's almost, Peter, it's almost like the price of doing business. You know what I'm saying? It's like, if we're making $6 billion, okay, and if we systematically use this racism here and deny black ownerships, and we get fined 300 and would you say, what was that figure, 335 million? Okay, that's okay. We'll if we making $6 billion, and we lose 335 million, it's probably the price of doing business. You know what I'm saying? It's just like, hey, you're going to get caught, and if you get caught, and this is what's going to happen. It's like, okay, so long as we're, like you said, in a quarter we made $6 billion. But the bigger thing for me, and I want to make this really, really clear, is okay. I'm in an interracial marriage. My wife is white. My children are biracial. Okay, so for me as a father and as a husband, my wife and my job and my wife's job is to educate our kids, to be a part of the human race. Okay, and to understand that there are there are good people, and there are good people in all races, and to try to see the good in all. But so I'm speaking out. My wife is speaking out in on all these things now, because she's experienced it. She's experienced it on the other side, meaning that when we go into a restaurant and I'm the last one into the restaurant and my children are with her, they will say, ma'am, how many is in your party? Okay. And it could be my wife, my youngest daughter, and me. And then they'll say table for two, and they'll assume that I'm not with them. Okay, or if I will go in first, and we've done this, where I've gone in first, and then they've come in right behind me, like literally right behind me, and the hostess will say, "Excuse me, you need a table for one," to making the assumption that my wife and my daughter are not with me, and then we walk in all together, and we still will feel that, or we will be seated in a certain portion of the restaurant. So again, I have to educate my kids, especially my 10-year-olds, to understand that there are going to be people that aren't going to, like her, for the color of her skin. Okay. And they're not going to like her, her dad. And then she has just been unbelievable trying to learn and understand that racism is born out of ignorance. Plain and simple. It is just born out of ignorance, and it's taught, and if it's allowed to, it continues to be taught and perpetuated. So if we know and we see an injustice, we got to speak on it. We got to speak about it. I have to educate her, and I got to empower her. Okay, and then hopefully we got to continue to evolve.
Well, so a couple things there that you brought up that are worth exploring a little bit deeper. One, I would say that the overt racism is based on ignorance. I think the covert racism oftentimes is based on brainwashing, and the brainwashing is very complicated.
Valid point.
And then the other thing is that I really wish that any white people watching, I really wish that we would be more empathetic and understand the trauma of I don't know if you know Van Green, assistant coach at Rice, but he talked about how when he pulls up to a nice hotel, he gets asked, "Are you sure you're at the right hotel, sir?" And all that type of thing. And that's infuriating and traumatizing for Black people when it happens again and again and again. And what I really want white people watching to understand is that, we say Black Lives Matter, and they do. And I'm trying to make the point that Black rights matter also, constitutional rights, because until Black rights matter, Black lives can't matter as much. But Black trauma and Black feelings matter as well. We as white people so many of us have unresolved issues with our parents and so on and so forth. And we value our trauma. But we look at that and say, oh, who cares that a maitre d' at a restaurant was, get over it. And it's like, well, now, wait a second. And it's part of the dehumanization of Black people. one of the reasons why we're able to treat y'all the way we treat y'all is because we don't value you fully as human beings. Still, as sad as that is to say. And so for white people watching, don't be dismissive toward Black trauma. Black people are human beings. Don't be dismissive toward Black people's rights being trampled on. Black people are American citizens. And just be more sensitive and more empathetic is my plea on this topic to white folks, because we saw, look how a lot of white people are behaving about having to wear masks, as an example. And there's nothing in the Constitution about masks. But if we even think for like a half a second that the government's trampling on our rights, we go ballistic. Mm-hmm. And yet somehow we're willing to turn a blind eye to Black people's rights being violated and say, well, okay, so you've been pulled over a couple of times when you hadn't done anything wrong, like big deal, get over it. Well, since when are constitutional rights something other than a big deal? Of course they are. It should be. So anyway, I just want to put those things out.
No, those are valid points, and it's a human race issue. It's a human race issue, and like you said, just to dismiss them as such and say get over it, just speaks volumes to a person's insensitivity.
Agreed. And then I'll give you one more stat because I just looked it up, because we're talking again about the isolated issue. In 2015 alone, looking at the 10 largest police departments alone, only 1 year, only 10 departments, they had to pay $248 million in police brutality claims. And so I don't know how you call $248 million in just 1 year in just 10 cities isolated. And so, I hope and wish that collectively, because what we need is 51% of white people to earnestly be on the right side of this, because then politicians have no choice. Mm-hmm. And that's what Dr. King was essentially able to persuade over the course of many long and brutal years. Eventually, 51% of white people in America looked at what was happening and said, this isn't right. And then and only then were politicians forced, compelled, because what they care about is re-election, of course. The problem is that after 1965, the white moderates, what I often call the fence sitters, they hopped their butts right back on the fence. They were like, oh, we did it. We passed the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. We did it. And they hopped their butts right back on the fence. Mm. And so right now, as more and more white people are hopping off the fence onto the right side, I sincerely hope they don't hop back on, because that was the big tragic error of white people after 65. We could have pushed through. 65 to 75 could have been an unbelievable decade of positive change, but it wasn't, because we thought we'd finished the race. And the reality is we weren't even 1/3 of the way through. So, well, Coach, what else do you have? What else do you have on your mind? I'd love to hear any additional thoughts or anything along those lines.
Peter, from my perspective and from my viewpoint, I just think that we have to continue to, like I said, have these opportunities, have these tough conversations, and people have to take inventory, of themselves, and I think we have to do a way better job educating, and then we have to, after we educate, we have to do a way better job of empowering people to use their voices, and use the power that they have to, continue to call out these type of situations to make, things better. And after we do that, we have to continue to evolve. Coach Cox has a great quote, and I'll leave you with this. People look and they see the protesting and they see the rioting, and then they talk about that. But Coach Cox said to our staff, this is not about a revolution, but it is about evolution. So we got to evolve, and so every person's got to, in their own way, take a look at themselves and see where they can be better. And then we got to educate, we got to empower, and we got to evolve, man.
I think that's a very wise way to phrase it. And the evolution, as you alluded to, it needs to be not just national, but individual.
Yeah.
because the
Absolutely.
reality is we can't. There's no way. You look at the Montgomery GI Bill after World War II. It was written totally racially neutrally.
Yes.
Right, and even because Truman made sure, he was naive about the implementation, but Truman made sure, or tried to make sure, based on the language of the law or the bill, the package, that black veterans were not going to be discriminated against. But there were no teeth in the bill. So employers, universities, banks, they discriminated against black people aggressively. There were something like 400,000 government-backed home mortgage loans to veterans, and that basically established the white middle class in Long Island. And and there were, I think, under 100 loans, government-backed loans issued to black people, black veterans, because the banks essentially said, we don't care if the government's backing the loan or not, we're not lending you money, based on just naked, overt racism. So we can write all the laws we want, but until the individuals implementing the laws evolve, it's not going to fix our collective problems. So, Coach Kevin Sutton, Rhode Island Rams, my friend, I really appreciate.
Absolutely. Thank you for the time.
It's like a beautiful morning in Rhode Island.
Yeah, it's unbelievable here. So thank you so much, Peter, for this opportunity to share with you. Thank you for your valued friendship.
And back at you, and we'll talk soon.
Take care.